Stay hungry, stay foolish.
As always, thanks to our sponsor, Zai. Zai is a global fintech which is innovating within its own field of expertise, building integrated financial services for digital native and non-native businesses. To check them out, and please do, they are a sponsor of the show, please support them, and therefore you're sponsoring us. Go to hellozai.com. What drives a 64-year-old woman to hurl herself off Niagara Falls in a barrel? Why do we often create bigger risks than the risks we try to avoid? Why are corporate boards worried about risky personal behaviour of their CEOs? Why are some nations quicker to recognise threats and risks like pandemics, technological change, and climate crisis? The answers define each person, each organisation, and society as distinctively as a fingerprint. Understanding the often surprising origins of these risk fingerprints can open our eyes, inspire new habits, catalyze innovation and creativity, inspire teamwork, and provide a beacon in a world that seems suddenly more uncertain than ever before. How you see risk and what you do about it depend on your personality and experiences. How you make these cost-benefit calculations depend on your culture, your values, the people in the room, and even unexpected things like what you've eaten recently, the temperature, the music playing, or the fragrance in the air. Being alert to these often unconscious influences will help you seize opportunity and avoid danger. Today's book is a clarion call for an entirely new conversation about our relationship with risk and uncertainty. Our guest examines why it's important to understand your risk fingerprint and how to make your risk relationship work better in life, in business life, and in the world in general. She shares insights, practical tools, and proven strategies that will help you understand what makes you who you are, and in turn, to make better choices, both big and small. We welcome friend of the Innovation Show and author of You Are What You Risk, Michele Wucker. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
That was a mouthful there, and I took out so much there, Michele, because there's so much in the book. As always, I love your writing, and I really enjoyed it. I love your style of writing, and I have a little surprise for you. I see behind you there, you have your beautiful image of the rhino. I'll let you tell a little bit about that in a second. But if you can see here, I always try and wear a pin to reflect the show, and here I have a rhino holding a balloon, so it was the closest I could get. He's grey, by the way, as well, which is useful, but the image behind you is meaningful. And for those of people who are watching us, I'll let you, Michele, you describe what it is, because it's something I saw on your brilliant newsletter, and you wrote a fantastic blog about that, and then we'll get into the book.
Sure. Well, you can see there's a big rhino across this dystopian cityscape, and there's a little girl standing in front of it. It's sort of like, Banksy meets Fearless Girl from Wall Street. And I don't know if you can see in the image there, but she's got a paintbrush with fuchsia paint, and she's just painted the rhino's toenails fuchsia, which is so awesome. And I got this on a day in July 2017. The Chinese government adopted the ideas in The Gray Rhino, my last book, about how to take a fresh look and do better at dealing with big, obvious problems. And they had just used the idea in their National Financial Work Conference, which sets financial policy for the next 5 years. And there was a big official front page editorial in People's Daily, the official newspaper, saying you need to watch out for gray rhino financial risks. And that included real estate, which of course you've seen in the news quite a bit lately. But it generated headlines all over the world. All these reporters were calling me. And so I went down to WGN Radio here in Chicago, which at the time was in the old Chicago Tribune building, which they've just turned into condominiums, which makes my head want to explode. But beautiful Gothic landmark. And WGN Radio at the time was in this sort of fishbowl studio, looking right out onto Michigan Avenue and looking out onto this art fair. And I had a friend in town who came down to the interview with me. And so afterwards, the interview was all about this, gray rhino crashing the Chinese stock market and making headlines around the world. And so it was a bit of a celebratory day. So I go out to the art fair with my friend and I see this. It's actually a print on metal. And just thought this is a sign. This is absolutely perfect. So I got to chat with the artist, and then of course when we started doing all things by Zoom over the past year, I put it up in my background, and I was getting so many questions about it. So I reached back out to the artist, Matthew Collianese, who calls himself the Pig Shark, which is based on a art piece he did early on, because he says nobody can remember or pronounce my last name. And so I did a little interview with him about it. And so you can see it on my blog at thegrayrhino.com, and it's also up on LinkedIn about how he created this picture. The little girl was actually inspired by a friend's daughter. We actually started working on it before the Fearless Girl statue went up, and he hadn't, Banksy was somewhere on his radar, but it wasn't, a deliberate connection. So I absolutely love it. And I love that other people love it too.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And you can see behind me, I have the Grey Rhino. We had an awesome show. It's probably about a year ago now where we covered the Grey Rhino.
Almost exactly a year.
It was just after the pandemic hit, actually. But we talked about this. And maybe as a quick refresher, let's share what the Grey Rhino is, because it's been a runaway success, excuse the pun for you, of this a charging success. But what I found really interesting is where it intersects with this book is it was more successful in certain territories. And if you zoom out and you understand you are what you risk, certain territories have more risk tolerance or not. So your book actually will be deemed more valuable in certain territories depending on the risk tolerance or the risk appetite in those places.
Yeah. And well, what's interesting to me is actually I think both books are even more valuable to the people who don't know how valuable they are, which is a bit paradoxical. But the Grey Rhino came out in 2016. It was my effort to explore the question of why some people, decision makers, see a big dangerous thing coming at them. Some people freeze. Some people do something to just get out of the way. Maybe it runs over the person behind them. And other people look at it and say, here's a problem that needs to be solved. And they turn it into an opportunity. And so the rhino was a metaphor in the great old tradition of Aesop, and other people have used animals to help humans to understand ourselves. And the idea is really to make an emotional connection and get ourselves to take a fresh look at the obvious things. You imagine this big gray rhino coming at you, and what are you going to do about it? And it's gray because if you look at rhinos and ask yourself what color they're gray. I mean, depending a little bit on what color of mud they've been rolling around in, but it should be really obvious that they're gray. But there are 5 species of rhinos that still walk the earth. And one of those species is black and the other one is white, even though neither one of those is actually the color. And so that to me seemed to be a great way to talk about how much more likely we are than we want to admit to take our eyes off of the obvious thing. So Grey Rhino came out in 2016 in the United States. All my friends who had books come out that year were so frustrated because, election campaign. This book came out. We had a standing room only book launch on the Upper West Side of Manhattan 2 weeks before the presidential primary. And so, of course, anything that wasn't Trump versus Hillary, you just didn't, you just couldn't get the news. So there's a little pushback. And there was also this real Black Swan culture in the US, this idea that, Black Swan is something you can't picture, you can't imagine. So it was meant to get people to broaden their imaginations and realize that they're more vulnerable to things that they can't even imagine, but you can't do anything about it. And so instead it got badly misused as a cop-out in hindsight. And so I think that the United States in particular still has that kind of Black Swan culture, this lack of responsibility. So the Grey Rhino came out in China in early 2017 and immediately was a huge bestseller. It had been out a couple weeks and my editor emailed me and she said, "You'll be happy to know it's in its 3rd printing, 30,000 copies." And I said, is that with 4 zeros? She says, yes. And of course it's, it's 10 times that much now. And it's been very influential in China. But, one of the questions that actually led to You Are What You Risk was, how come some countries are so sensitive to risk, they pay so much attention to it, and paradoxically, the more attention you pay to it, the more you recognize it and do something about it, actually the less risk there is. And so you get this very interesting feedback loop between when you're aware and thinking about risks, you are reducing them. And so that actually allows you to take risks that in another culture might be seen as bigger risks, but objectively they're actually smaller because you've done more to deal with them. So it kind of blows out of the water this idea that you can calculate a risk, assign a credit rating. I mean, like we did with the subprime mortgages, which didn't work out real well in 2007, 2008. We see it in everyday life with weather forecasts, but even that forecast, 40% chance of rain today. One person will say, "Oh, I better bring the umbrella." And another person will say, "Oh, don't bother." They even if it's 90%, they don't bother. And someone else is superstitious and says, "Well, if I bring the umbrella, then that means it won't rain." So everybody looks at this set number and it's something completely different to everyone. And since the great financial crisis, there's been so much more attention to making lists of risks and assigning probabilities and impact and blah, 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 and lots of that. But we're only starting to get the attention that we need on risk governance, on how we respond to risks. And in particular, this feedback loop that I was talking about, that, with climate change, the more you pay attention to it and do something about it, the smaller the risk becomes. But you have to be aware. And that's part of these risk fingerprints that I'm talking about. How much attention do you pay to risk, and why? How much of that's from your innate personality? How much of it is from, the policy ecosystem in your community, in your country? How much of it is from your experiences and the people around you? So it becomes sort of like a room full of funhouse mirrors. But understanding all of these elements is such a powerful tool for making your own decisions about risk and doing a better job about it.
You were so kind to write an endorsement for my book at the time when actually you were finalizing the manuscript, and I'm so grateful because I didn't know you were going through that at the time, and you did take the time to read the book and stuff like that. But I say that to say I saw such a correlation between, one of the things I talk about is the change appetite in organizations, and I often think about it like a changed thermostat, that everybody's thermostat is set to a different setting. So it's a feedback mechanism that's like, okay, when the temperature hits this temperature, this happens, and fear kicks in. And I thought about the same thing with risk, because you found this, though, even though you wrote The Grey Rhino, which is in a way is a mirror of You Are What You Risk. You wrote it for businesses and governments in mind. It resonated massively with individuals, and so many individuals got in touch with you about their own Grey Rhino experiences.
Yeah, it was really surprising to me. And I was looking back through the book recently, and there is a line near the bottom, suggesting that this is, this might help you deal with your own personal gray rhinos. But, my best friend used it in a career situation. She was working for a state college at the time, and government came in that was very slashed the budget, and she says, "Okay, I need to come up with a plan B." Went to library school and is now very happily ensconced as a librarian. But she talked about the gray rhino during that, and her mother was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and she used the book for that. Another woman said to me, "The end of my marriage was a gray rhino. All my friends were trying to tell me, and I didn't want to see it." And there was a guy in Indiana who wrote this beautiful blog post about breast cancer, actually. A friend of his was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she was like, all right, very aggressive treatment. She got on it right away. And then he went and he ran a marathon to raise funds for breast cancer research. And there was an 8th grader in Bangalore who used the gray rhino in a project on digital addiction. She had this big digital detox project that she took all the way to the United Nations. And at all of my readings, all around the world, people would ask me, how do I apply this to my personal life? And one young guy in Shanghai in the summer of 2017 had come to the book event, and there were huge storms. It really took a lot of effort to get there. In fact, I almost didn't get there because of my flight was canceled and I had to take a train instead. But he came up to me, he wanted the selfie and the autograph, and he says, "You helped me so much with my life." And I almost wanted to say, "Oh, is there's someone standing behind me?" Because, I'm a big geek, right? Policy, finance, strategy. I'm happy as a clam with spreadsheets. And I didn't really think of myself as a self-help person, but people were responding organically to this. And I also got a lot of of questions about the relationship between what was going on. There was a talk I did in Milwaukee, and a nurse was talking about how people were coming in with mental health, stress issues because of all this high-level policy discussion about whether we were going to continue Obamacare or not. And so there was a real connection there. And I struggled with this. I didn't know what to do. So I called a friend of mine who was a really great sounding board during the Great Rhino, Jeff Leonard, who was a CEO of a private equity firm. And he said, Michele, there's more of a connection between this personal and business and policy than you think. He says, our investment committee met recently about the things that didn't turn out. And in every case, we look back and the red flags were there in the due diligence, but we didn't pay as much attention to them because they weren't the business model or the macroeconomic situation or the quality of the product itself. He said it was the bad personal risk decisions by the CEO. It was the, cheating on Ashley Madison. It was drunk driving. It was domestic violence. It was speeding. And there since then has actually been a lot of research confirming a correlation between, say, whether you were one of the people in the Ashley Madison spousal cheating website database breach and whether you were doing securities violations. And so he said, Michele, you really need to look at this connection. And of course, I delved into it quite a bit more and found out that a lot of these corporate due diligence firms were now specifically looking into the CEO's risk behaviors, and that corporate boards are paying a lot more attention. We saw the situation at WeWork with some of the very eccentric behavior by the founder, throwing tantrums if people didn't have the right kind of tequila and walking around barefoot. And there was another firm whose CEO was bragging about a relationship with someone in the news, and their insurance company came and said, we're not going to insure you anymore if this guy's the CEO. He's just bad at taking personal risks. So I realized there too that there was a feedback loop, and it was a big risk decision as I was writing the book because, publishers like things to be packaged very nicely. Like, this is a business book. This is a current affairs book. This is a self-help book. And I really struggled because that's not how people package books. But I felt like this feedback loop was so important in understanding any one of those elements. And I felt like I needed to address all of them. And it was actually a strength, even though it was a big risk publishing wise.
And it's like a Gordian knot. I mean, you can't change what people do till you change what they think. 75% plus of business transformations fail. And we all look to the technical reasons it failed, but it's actually people. It's people at the heart of the transformations. And I wanted to share something because the last time we spoke, you shared a personal grey rhino that was coming for you, which was dental care, which was actually going to the dentist yourself. But you revealed this time, when you reflected, it wasn't quite the real risk or the real rhino that was actually coming for you. And I want to share this one because this is really important. Many CEOs and change makers and change agents within organizations listen to the show, and we have a tendency to overwork. And you realize through writing this book, actually, one of the risks I've been taking is my own health. And I wanted to quote this because you say this, and I think it's important for people out there to look after both their mental health and their physical health. You say, I'm fortunate because when I am unhappy or stressed, I feel it physically. And therefore that becomes a warning sign that I need to do something. And many of us suppress that and we keep going thinking we're some type of hero. And actually, when you think about it and zoom out, you go, well, why am I working in the first place? I shouldn't be living to work. I should be working to live.
Yeah, it's true. And it's really changed over time. And it goes back to partly, how I was raised. I mean, my dad was a private school educator, and we didn't have great family dental insurance, and we had pretty good genes, good teeth. So, we didn't go to the dentist a lot when I was a kid, and that sort of stretched into my 20s, and I had almost like a phobia. And, so for years it was, they'd say come every 6 months, and I'd be like, push out. He kept pushing out. And then I was diagnosed with celiac disease, which does a number on your gums. They still haven't come up with a good explanation as why, but my periodontal surgeon was like, oh yeah, celiac disease. Oh, got it. So so then I ended up having to have some gum surgeries, and now I go every 3 months, and I still have issues. But it was really that upbringing of, starting out with not having gotten into the habit early of going to the dentist, and then I had to change my habits going forward. And it was, certain experiences. I mean, when the first gum surgery, it didn't take all the way. I had to have another one a couple months later, and so that changed my behaviors, because once you have this shock and you experience really bad consequences, you change what you do. And what I'm trying to get people to do is to think about the consequences, to picture them, to look at what your friends have experienced, to hear what other people have done, so that you don't have to get to that point before you change your behavior. And health, similarly, when I was young, when I was in high school, my mom went back to school. And so I was like, watching all the kids, and, I was at a new school in Texas, and just like overworked myself quite a bit. And that just became a habit. And, I didn't learn anything otherwise. And so while watching these kids, I finished high school in 3 years and had a part-time job that paid for me to spend the summer in Europe after high school. And I look back now and I look at those habits that later in life I had to unlearn. And, I interviewed a couple of younger people in the book, including a woman who, when I interviewed her, she was about to graduate college. She was in her last year of college, and she was talking about her decisions about, what kind of career she wanted and whether she was going to go study abroad and things like that. And she was asking herself questions about burnout, about health, about personal growth, about what she was comfortable with, that I wish I had known to ask myself way back then. And, we've evolved in the things that we learn, or like leadership training, which until, 10 or 15 years ago, I would have told you was the most ridiculous thing ever. In fact, one of my earlier jobs, they made me take a management training course, which I didn't realize was a sign that, they think you're going places. But it was this one of these silly exercises where you have a team, and you have some string and some tongue depressors and some cups, and you're making it was some cheesy experiment and experience. And I was, for the first time in my life, I was like the bad kid in the back of the room who was acting out and not paying attention because I thought it was so stupid. And, it wasn't until later that I understood some of the power of that. But later on, when I got involved with the World Economic Forum, the Forum of Young Global Leaders, and they did a lot of leadership training, some of those questions are so powerful, and that they're the reasons that I actually started writing books again after having sort of sat out for several years. So it's really powerful. The experiences you have, the places you look for learning, the people who you are in touch with, and then what you do with that.
Yeah, and I love that what you said there about the leadership training. Like, so we say, for example, innovation happens at the intersections of all the literature shows that, and you yourself, the intersections of your different disciplines have led to this book, which is a key output of the book, as well as that you look at biases, cognitive biases. We all have them. If we're human, we have biases, etc. And it's one of the reasons you mentioned, I was hoping you weren't going to slam it too much. I do executive coaching, and one of the reasons, though, is because you can't look at organizational development or change initiatives and innovation without looking at the people. They're so intersectional. And this idea of looking in the mirror and understanding what drives me, what doesn't, etc. And then one of the things that the book does for us, your book, is gives us extreme empathy, I feel, to go, I'm not going to be judgmental of someone else. I have no idea what's happening in the background. And this gets me to this question. You share a beautiful story of your bobon, your grandmother, and that, and the experiences you grew up in, and the observation of those as a child have an undoubted impact on your own tolerance of risk in the future. And this happened for you.
Absolutely. Yes. So my grandmother, Bobon, she was Belgian. it lived just outside of Brussels, and our family was very deeply affected by the war. I mean, the Nazis came in, and they took the wine cellar, they occupied the houses, they killed all the family's pigeons, and Bobon was in her teens at the time, and she was riding her bicycle for the resistance, like taking messages, which was kind of a big risk, for a very good purpose. And that's where she met my grandfather, who's an American GI. And so he actually tried to start a popcorn business in Belgium, which was ahead of its time. They still thought that the popcorn was pig food. And I wish he could see Garrett popcorn here in Chicago, like super high-end, premium, amazing, wonderful popcorn. Every time I go there, I think of my grandpa, but my bon papa. So they came to the States when my mother was 3, and I think a lot of her life was shaped by this real combination of having done these daring things. And I mean, moving to a new country where you don't know anyone is kind of a big deal. But she also, in parts of her life, she really made preparations. So when she died it was a little over a decade ago, her freezer was full from the top to the bottom with, 10 years worth of garden vegetables, but frozen butter, pounds and pounds of butter. The cupboards were full of, pounds and pounds of sugar. So, there was no chance she was going to run out of that. And I just used the last sheet of aluminum from these boxes and boxes of aluminum. So she was not going to run out of that stuff. But when it came to other things like her health, she had an abdominal aneurysm, and the doctor said once it gets to 5 centimeters, it's riskier to leave it in than to do the surgery to take it out. She, it was 6.5 before they let her take it out. And there was another time where, my mom hadn't been able to reach her, so she went over, and Bobon had all these big, giant cathode ray tube televisions all around the house. And she'd been trying to lift one of them. I mean, 80-something-year-old woman with abdominal aneurysm. She threw her on her back, and she'd been on the floor for a couple of days. And she wouldn't let my mom take her to the emergency room until my mom just finally had to put her feet down. And so it was this weird mix of being very, very risk conscious and prepared in parts of her life, and not at all in other parts of her life. And so we saw that contrast between, when she died, there was, the financial arrangements weren't in place. It was a complete mess. And then you had my dad's parents who were, my grandpa was actually also an entrepreneur. He had a hardware store. It was an Ace franchise in Milwaukee, but they had everything just perfectly organized. Like all the financial stuff was perfectly in order. They had the menu for the funeral. They had the gravestones, everything except for the date of death was already carved in there. And so it's this like complete difference. And so in my family, there was this constant clash of risk attitudes. In fact, I remember going to church when I was a kid. My parents would take different cars because they couldn't agree on how much time to leave to get someplace. And so I think it's probably not entirely an accident that I've become obsessed with risk and risk decisions, because it was so different in my house. And it was like, don't talk on the phone during a thunderstorm because you're going to get electrocuted. And then my dad, I like to tease him that he's still asking me if I'm still on track to graduate college in 4 years.
Brilliant. I love that story because it highlights the empathy that we can be very judgmental. And I think this is the beauty of the work you do, the work we learn on biases, on cognitive biases and blockers, because it makes us think, hey, you can't judge a behavior in isolation. You got to look at the context all the time. You got to zoom out and go, well, what happened that influenced Bobon to make those decisions, and what happens all of us to make those decisions. And one of those things is the economic climate at the time. And I mentioned in the intro the story of Annie Edson, the woman in her 60s who decides to go off Niagara Falls in a pickle barrel. And this is a great story to go, well, looks like a crazy decision, but in her context, the risk was worth it.
In some ways, yes. And in other ways, no. Like when she was making the decision, definitely. And, how I got that story is actually kind of a funny story. My best friend's daughter was in Chicago over the holidays. And I went to a party a friend of hers hosted. And the host of a video podcast, Cooking with Drag Queens, were there. And they had just come back from Niagara Falls and were telling me that story. So that's how I ended up with it. It was great because it was at a time when I was struggling. How do I open the book? And so, of course, she had a very interesting set of experiences during her life. I mean, at one point she'd been financially reasonably well off, but her father died early, her husband died early. So here's a couple of big shocks that have the power to change how you think about things. She'd been a teacher all over the States, even in Mexico. So she had a lot of experiences with new situations. But it was later in her life, she was kind of running out of money. She needed funds fast. She was trying to figure out what to do. And she somehow came up with this idea that like nobody had ever gone over Niagara Falls in a barrel before, or in any way, as far as I know. And so she had this sort of, I think, innate personality and experience that predisposed her to taking a chance. But she also, she souped up that pickle barrel, was like padding and, leather things to hold on to. And she sent her cat over the falls in the barrel ahead of time, and
MVP, a minimal viable product.
I have a picture of her. Yes, well, I have a picture of her with the barrel and the cat, which I hope was after that. There's sort of conflicting accounts about what happened.
She's like, remember that show Exhibit, Pimp My Ride? She's like, Pimp My Barrel. She was way ahead of the game.
And she hired this like promoter, which turned out to have been not a great risk decision in the end. And she was, checking all of the weather. It was actually supposed to go a couple days earlier when she was still 63 and ended up going on her birthday, because the earlier attempt was not deemed to be good weather. And so she went over and it was a success. And she'd had this idea that she was going to give speeches and make money from speeches and stuff, but hadn't really factored in that she wasn't a great speaker. The accounts I read were differing, but I think they were even being polite, the way they put that. But the other thing that she did is they had said that she was in her 40s. To, prejudice against older women, whatever. They thought it would be a better story if she was younger. And so the promoter found some other woman who was actually in her 40s, and they stole the pickle barrel, and they went on tour pretending that this other woman was her. So obviously they took a risk in lying about her age, and it was, I don't know how much due diligence she did on this promoter guy. And in the end, she lived out the rest of her life in poverty pretty much, but, selling tchotchkes and memorabilia and stuff, at the foot of Niagara Falls. And, a lot of other people tried it after her. They didn't all make it, but it was, to me, it was a really interesting confluence of personality, experiences, this sort of research that she put into it. And also, I think the times, it was a, turn of the century. I mean, the president had recently been assassinated. I mean, you'd seen, big economic booms and, uncertainty in some ways similar to today. And so you can't separate that personal experience from all the other things around it. And so when you're thinking about why you're making the risk decisions that you are, think about what's going on around you. And we see that in what you see called the Great Resignation. I saw in August, 3% of the US workforce left their jobs in 1 month alone. And people are changing the decisions that they're making. And some of the news stories describe this as, they're taking more risks or, less risks. And that's not the way I see it at all. I see it as they're measuring and prioritizing and perceiving risks differently. The risk of staying at a job where the boss is a jerk and your coworkers won't get vaccinated or wear masks versus going and doing something safer. The risk of being a frontline worker, a restaurant worker, retail worker where your customers are jerks and won't wear masks and won't get vaccinated. They're like, if I'm going to be taking that kind of risk, I need to be compensated properly for it. So it's really how all of these things come together, and you can't understand why you're making your own decisions without understanding the broader perspective.
There's a quote by the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, 544 BC, Michelle. He said, "No man ever walks in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man." And, excuse the language being very masculine. It's, in some cases still very much is, but that is 544 BC. So let's cut him some slack for the time he said it. But one of the things I wanted to emphasize about that was, it's why I like it's my own mental model about change and risk now is the thermostat, because if you take that as the environment or the economic environment changes, that's the temperature on the outside. But then my experience of what I've experienced over the past period of time changes, but it changes me and it changes my risk tolerance. And I say all this to say, I am a case study for you in this. Like, I retired from professional sport. I didn't need to. I'd been offered a further 2 years in my contract from Toulouse at the time, a French club. But I retired into the 2008 financial crisis because I felt the playing field had been leveled. And I was like, look, to myself and to my wife, I said, this is going to be difficult, but I may as well do it when it's difficult for everybody. So the change in the environment helped me make that decision. And then I used that same experience again. Last year, I went out on my own and created my own business because exactly what you said, in times of instability, people look at risk very differently. Those who feel they've nothing to lose feel they have a license to take a bigger risk. And this is a key point. Absolutely.
And, it's interesting, all this wonderful behavioral science work on cognitive biases and things like that, which, of course, I went into in the Grey Rhino. But it's really been the past few years where the conversation has shifted a little bit from saying, here are these biases humans have, to understanding the variations among humans. I mean, yes, there's loss aversion, but this person is going to have more and this person is not. There's been some work showing the effectiveness of self-awareness and habits to try to change your responses to these cognitive biases to counteract them. And that each person, yes, is susceptible to a set of universal human biases, but they don't affect us all the same way. And, there's another new book, Noise, by Daniel Kahneman and colleagues, which actually a friend of mine in China just sent me a picture that it's right next to my book in China. The Chinese edition just came out in September. I think they have a little bit more focus on, okay, this is the right decision, and all these other factors that go into it are the noise that are affecting that. And I see it very differently, that a lot of that noise is not just, incidental noise. That's who we are. That's our identity as a person, as an organization, as a group, as a society. And this idea of a right decision is just, it's an illusion, just like the investment grade subprime mortgage-backed securities. And I think taking into account how much perception and response plays into how we deal with a particular risk, whether it's a passive risk, the risk of not doing something to head off a problem, or an active risk, making an investment or starting a business or going to school or bungee jumping. Those choices are different for every person. And I get asked a lot if there's an ideal risk personality, a part of the fingerprint. And, my answer is no, but there is perhaps an ideal mix. There's an ideal way to optimize your circumstances for your personality. If you're somebody who likes change, who gets bored easily, who's comfortable with uncertainty, maybe a big traditional Fortune 50 corporation with lots of bureaucracy is maybe not the right environment for you. But if you're the kind of person who, really likes, detail and structure, being at a startup might be more uncomfortable, or you might be the most valuable person at that startup because it's a place where everybody's all about moving quickly and breaking things. And it's really having that mix. So for a big legacy corporation that's worried about becoming obsolete or, wanting to innovate, they should look at the environment that they're creating. Is there room for failure? Is management structure flat or very hierarchical? Do people feel that they have the power to say, hey, I've got a great idea that, may or may not work, but is worth exploring? Do people feel that they have the power to say, hey, this is really cool, but have we thought about these possible things that could go wrong? And maybe we should be thinking about that to make sure that they don't go wrong, before we release the product. And so it's also about the mix of people. People will often gravitate towards a particular career based on their innate risk personality or the risk type that a UK consultancy that I write about, psychological consultancy, has done with the risk type compass. Are you the kind of person who is going to be more adventurous? Are you going to be much more prudent? Are you going to be methodical in dealing with the risk? Are you completely impulsive? Are you anxious? Does risk stress you out? Are you so calm that maybe you're not paying attention to risk that you ought to be? And having a mix of those personalities is very important. And a lot of industries tend to have people who've gravitated toward that industry because they are of similar risk types, and they don't have the variety that they need to offset the strengths of one of those types, and to offset the weaknesses of one of those types, and to really capitalize on the benefits of one of those types. It's a huge issue in board governance right now. All the benefits of having diversity of opinion for helping both to take good risks, to innovate, and to avoid bad risks.
For those of you who are loving the conversation, we're going to go into generational, so Gen Z, millennials, etc., because all that makes a huge impact on how somebody will perform in your company. And if you're a HR director hiring people for organizations, understanding this is such a competitive advantage for you. We'll also talk a little bit about gender as well and the impacts that has both for the person in the role but also the organization in a little while. But you've mentioned this a few times, Michele, the term risk fingerprint. And it's a beautiful term that you've coined, and it's why there's a fingerprint on the book. And I have to share this because apart from its meaning, it's absolutely beautiful written line that I pulled from the book. And fingerprint is the combination of those things we talked about: personality traits, experiences, social context. That is a core component of each of our identities. But here you say, each of us has a risk personality that is as distinct as a fingerprint. Our risk fingerprints start with our underlying traits, which you might think of as ridges, arches, loops, and whorls that give us the fingerprint structure and make it distinctive. Our experiences alter the fingerprint, much as a cut might leave a scar. I absolutely love how you wrote that, but it encapsulates the exact idea of risk fingerprint.
Thank you. And of course, I love metaphors, whether it's the gray rhino or the cockfight in my first book, but it really seemed to, to pull together all of these different things. And actually I have a funny story about how the fingerprint came to be on the cover and how it became to be so big in the book. So I'd had a couple of quick references to risk fingerprint in the book. And when I was looking at possible cover designs, it's really hard to represent risk. It's so abstract. And I'm not going to put a roulette wheel or a couple of dice. That's too cheesy, not my style. So my publisher had sent an initial draft with the symbol of chaos. The audience who's into gaming will know it's basically 4 arrows, so 8 points with arrows going in different directions, which I shared with a bunch of friends who write business books generally, and they completely got it right away. And I sent it to my librarian friend and a designer friend, and they looked at it and said, "Huh? I don't get it." I'm like, "Okay, that's not what I'm going for." So then I thought, and I said, "Okay, well, how about this maze idea?" because that represents choices and possible directions and uncertainty. So we sent it back to the designer, and there was one design that was beautiful artistically, but just wouldn't work, in a little thumbnail. And somebody suggested, and I sent these out to my friends on Facebook, and someone suggested, what about doing the maze as an icon? Which was one of he had shrunk the symbol of chaos into an icon. So I went and found some maze icons, and we threw those examples up. And someone said, "Oh, this one I saw on a Chinese menu." And I'm like, "Okay, that's not what I'm going for." But someone said, "Hey, that one looks just like a fingerprint," and it was this big facepalm moment. I'm like, I write about risk fingerprints, fingerprint. Identity, you are what you risk. So I went back to my editor. I said, this is it. And so then in the next draft of the book, because I was already working on the final draft, I really expanded that bit about the fingerprint. So it was this beautiful interaction of design and feedback and the real idea that I wanted to get across. So it was really exciting to me, but without wanting to belabor the metaphor, it really fit perfectly. And also even, what kind of experiences you have, what kind of habits, if you're doing manual labor, you get rough calluses. If you use soft, raw shea butter lotion, you get nice, soft things. This is the wildest part of the research in the book, was the temperature in the room. Like when it's colder, you're actually going to be likely to take more risks. So just like, your fingerprint, if you soak in the bathtub too long, if your hand is sweaty, all of that is going to affect your fingerprint. But the physical environment is so important, whether it's, the music you're listening to, if it's, up tempo, you're going to be a little bit edgier. There's research showing that if you had spicy food for lunch or whatever meal for the next few hours afterwards, you're going to be more accepting of possible risks. All of these wild things, even, the color in the room, all of these biofeedback factors that traders, of course, pay a lot of attention to, affect your cortisol levels, your stress levels, the dopamine hits in your brain. And so there's this very strong physical aspect as well. So that's part of why I love this physical image as something that explains why we take the risk decisions that we do.
I love that. And the stuff on like olfactory senses, so the sense in the air, the environment. I talk to organizations about this all the time, and I think they think I'm a bit crazy when I'm talking about even the artifacts in the environment, or literally the words on the wall. So your values on the wall and all that stuff. It all has a massive impact on how people think. And, I was thinking there when you talked about the spices. If I have to pitch an idea to my wife next time that's a bit risky, I'll be like, "I'll order, babe. I got this one. She'll have the spicy chicken and extra spice, please." So let's share some of those. I wasn't going to go there yet, but let's do that, because I love the stuff you share on those influences that are somewhat invisible. I mentioned them in the introduction. Let's jump there, and then we'll come back to risk ecosystem, which is another key term in the book.
Sure. Yeah, but there are other things like, whether you're a smoker or not. There's some research showing that people who are smokers are more likely to take jobs that are more physically risky, and also more likely to accept less pay for those. And of course, there is a bit of a chicken and the egg here. You're not sure how much is correlation and how much is causation. But I think that, there's also some research around, addictive behaviors and risk. And of course, you think of, gamblers is the first thing that you think of. And there is research around certain dopamine receptors that affect how you deal with risk. There's, I think, if my memory serves, 124 different genetic markers, although they're not super well understood yet. And a lot of questions still to be answered about things like birth order. From the studies I looked at, you couldn't really tell a big difference, but as an oldest child, I think it may be a matter of, that people in different birth orders have experienced certain risks differently, but the research is inconclusive on that. The colder temperatures, as I mentioned, there've been some studies with birds as well as humans. It's just fascinating. And you think about some of the biggest decisions in your life that you're taking, and we don't think about the environment around us and how that affects it. And of course, there are things, your age. There's a lot about the risk itself, whether it's like an emotional risk or a more calculated risk, and particularly among teenagers. There's some research showing differences between adults and teenagers depending on whether it's a hot or a cold risk. There's so many factors they can get quite overwhelming. But the spicy food one is the one that just always sticks with me. And I love spicy food. And actually, interestingly, a lot of cultures have stereotypes about people who like spicy food being bigger risk takers. There might be something to that. And then you also look at the bigger historical context. And, I think of, Mexico, India, places, or Thailand, places where the temperature is actually quite high. And you go way back to times before we had really good refrigeration. And on the one hand, the spices, kill some of the bacteria, but they also hide some of the bacteria. So they're both making it less risky and making it more risky at the same time. And I think there's probably some really fascinating dietary feedback loop around risk taking and cultural attitudes.
Well, let's jump there because we talk about risk ecosystem, but let's marry that to geography, because where we're from also has a massive impact on how we think. And one of the great ways I experienced this actually, where I looked through two lenses, which one was your book, and then about a year ago we had the great Robert Sapolsky on the show, and we had such a great chat, one of my favorite episodes, on his book Behave. And it's so fascinating when you read that and your book and you put them together, because there's so much research there that corroborates each other and also complements in so many ways. But one of the ones that I found so fascinating was, and one of the studies that he shares, he talks about how if you are from an environment or a geographical region that experienced disease in the past, or an outbreak of disease, you're going to be more xenophobic and you're not going to be so welcoming of outsiders. And again, we judge people by the cover, and we kind of go, oh, that person's so xenophobic, they hate outsiders, all that kind of stuff. And we can't do that without looking actually at the geographical factors that happened in their own risk fingerprint.
Absolutely. And, I love Robert Sapolsky's book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And fun fact, some people believe that actually rhinos and zebras are even more closely related than rhinos and elephants. So huge fan of his work. But this geography is a very big part of it. And these experiences, I mean, we've certainly seen it with the pandemic, places that have had more recent, more serious outbreaks, countries that were familiar with SARS, were more likely to wear masks. And there are other reasons for wearing masks, and, socially acceptable reasons. I went to Japan for the first time in 2008, and I had this brilliant idea that I was going to go during cherry blossom season, because Japan, cherry blossoms, completely not thinking about my terrible seasonal allergies. And I very quickly came to appreciate the benefits of masks. But so, there are countries where mask wearing was already common, either because of pollution or cherry blossoms or whatever, or, recent outbreaks. And there's research, my friend Jeremy Howard, a data scientist, had done a lot of research early on in the pandemic saying that the countries that had wider spread mask wearing were the ones that were doing quite a bit better. So that's really important. Geography is part of it. Some of the countries that had lower infection rates were, islands. but that doesn't, that doesn't always last. And there's this sort of feedback loop too, whereas if you're really successful early on in the pandemic, then your guard gets let down. And we've seen that with Israel, with Australia, with Peru. So this relationship with risk is sort of cyclical. It's a constant learning and updating process. And in terms of a risk ecosystem, so I think that involves some of the historical context, the social context, but also the policy measures that are put into place. And I think it's important to think about risk ecosystems in two senses. First, how policy protects us from the bad risks and how it encourages good risks. Education, for example. Biggest financial risk a lot of people take, and it happens very early in life before their brains are even, fully mature. And that's a risk you want to take more. You want more people to take, and countries have very, very different approaches to what they encourage or what they don't. And, bankruptcy laws. And the other part is not just the policy environment, but the people around you. My favorite example of this is here in Chicago. It took months into the pandemic before I started taking public transportation again. And the first time I did, I went down to the dentist. That was the big scary moment. So I took the bus. There's this beautiful express bus that goes down Lakeshore Drive, and it's just wonderful. I got on that, and everybody's wearing masks, social distancing, totally comfortable, beautiful view of the lake as we go down. That was awesome. On the way back, I took the L, our subway, which is elevated part of the way, which is why they call it L. Oh man, I had to change cars 4 times. Kids coming on with, the mask under the chin or no mask and blah, 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 and crowding. And it was months and months before I took the train again. And it was such a great illustration of how the behavior of the people around us affects the risk to us and how the way we act affects the risk of other people. There was some research showing that some of the most effective risk messaging around masks and social distancing was, think about your grandma, think about other people. The other part was, something that's effective, that's simple, that you can do every day, that works. And so the communications that you're getting from the media, from elected officials, from Twitter and Facebook, that all plays into things as well. And we need to be aware of it.
Speaking of the pandemic, because you do dedicate time to this, one of the things I found really interesting was the intersection again between the grey rhino and you are what you risk. So I mentioned this saying in my book, the more you sweat in times of peace, the less you bleed in war. But also this idea that when you do get a warning shot across your bow, do you react to it or not? Do you take that? So you might have a health scare, you might have, be called up on something in your role that if you don't buck up here, buck out, you're out of here, right? This type of thing. But this happened in the pandemic. So we celebrate in many ways New Zealand as a great country that was so reactive to the pandemic, but they were actually proactive because they had warning shots, and so did South Korea. And I think this is a key point because this can be used for organizations because there's always signals of the impending change. But you have to firstly listen for them. You have to have ways to listen out for them to detect the changes in the business environment. But then you have to make the changes. And this doesn't happen in a lot of cases. And these 2 studies were fascinating.
Such an important point. And it goes back to what I said before, that, people spend so much time listing risks and things and don't spend enough time on the response. And of course, New Zealand's case was that there had been a ranking that came out of preparedness some months before. And it had said, New Zealand, you're not doing as well as you should be. And they looked at it and I said, let's do something about it. But then you look at, say, the United States, where in 2019, under the Trump administration, there was actually a scenario planning exercise involving a pandemic very similar to what we experienced. There also had been so many reports from the WHO, from Johns Hopkins University, from all kinds of think tanks, public health experts. Bill Gates' talk in 2015, his TED Talk, saying, we need to be prepared for a pandemic, and we're not. So many of these warnings, and it was the uptake that was the problem, that, people had blueprints for what to do with it. It's like the example in the Gray Rhino of Hurricane Katrina. Scenario planning exercise, weeks before that. They had the plan of what to do. So I think we need a lot more attention to that mechanism. We saw in the United States the pandemic being very, very polarized. Pew Research did a study of approval of government response to pandemic, and it was 14 countries, and they found that in the US, the partisan gap was 47 points, like massively wider than any other country. And so it seems to me that when it is something so crucial as disaster response and disaster risk reduction and prevention, that in countries that are politically polarized, that needs to be taken away from this really capricious political decision-making process. And I think that we need a lot more accountability for decision makers, whether it's in policy or business or, personally, for, okay, how are you dealing with this? And the way things work, I write about this a lot in the Gray Rhino, is that the way our system is set up is that we tend to celebrate people for picking up the mess that somebody else created, but not so much celebrating people for preventing the mess. The RFK Profiles in Courage Awards, they gave one to George Bush, the father, for breaking his promise to not raise taxes because it was the right move to do economically. And, some people say, well, he paid the price for that. Other people say, well, no, it was the broader economic circumstances that cost him that election. You can debate that 6 ways to sunrise, but it comes down to he made a really hard political decision, and it was the right thing to do. And I'm really glad to see when organizations celebrate those difficult decisions, because they're often not popular and people second guess it. We hear about Cassandras, which has come to mean, somebody who just, warns in vain. But the original myth was that there was a curse put on Cassandra that she would make correct warnings and nobody would believe her. We've kind of missed that part of the myth. And what we hear too often is, a politician hears, hey, here's a big danger. They do something about it. The danger doesn't happen. And then people are like, oh, you were all upset for nothing. And so we need to do a lot better job of celebrating crises prevented and costs avoided.
It reminded me of an amazing quote. So Dee Hock is a friend of the show. He's the founder of Visa. He's now going into his 93rd birthday. He wrote the foreword for my book, and it was amazing. But there's a quote by him that you will absolutely love, exactly about what you're talking about. He said, the person who fights for a dying cause is admired, supported, and honoured. The person who fights for a new cause struggling to be born is misunderstood, reviled, and attacked. Nothing is more difficult than taking the lead in the new order of things, which absolutely nails the point or reinforces the point you're making. Because I often think about this in innovation work, where some CEO or leader or some change maker within the organization is fighting for something. They are a Cassandra. They can see the way it's going to go. And the status quo by its very nature quashes them and keeps them at bay, because it's like, well, we're kind of benefiting from now. We'll milk the cash cow as much as we can. We'll kill the golden goose, etc. And you see, this is one of the things I think is so important about your book from an innovation perspective or a change perspective and a life perspective itself. But on that, I thought about this, where the hot hand fallacy. So things worked for me in the past. I made the right calls, etc. I'm overconfident now. And I thought about that. Well, if, for example, my past experience had been negative and that affects my risk fingerprint and I'm less likely to take risks, I have more risk aversion. The same happens for my positive experiences in the past. And then I might think that hand I keep playing will work out again. And confidence plays a huge role in risk fingerprints. And I thought one of the most fascinating ones I read in your book was the story of Germany, and Germany in the political arena, because of the history of Germany and the loss of confidence.
Yeah, it was interesting. My friend Jan Tejau was in Chicago giving a lecture, and so we got to catch up about it. And he looked at this and really explained that the historical circumstances were a big part of why Germany tends to be so cautious on many things, but that it's also lent itself to a safety culture. Like, why are German engineers so revered? And it goes back to this. And so that goes to the importance of different approaches to risks. You want to have the methodical engineer who's paying attention to the closest, tiniest detail. And you want the dreamer. You want this whole mix of people, which is really important for innovation. Because if you have the dreamer without the person paying attention to details, things can go very, very, very wrong, and quash the dream once there's a little mishap. So I think it's absolutely important. You mentioned risk aversion. It's a term I have some take issue with in the book, of course, because it's often applied to women or to millennials, and so many professional women come up to me and say, "Oh, well, I'm really risk averse." Because it's almost like they've gotten this thing in their head, and then they talk about their careers and the things that they've done, and they're the things that to many people on the outside would say, hey, those actually are big risks. And there's something called stereotype threat, where if you think you're supposed to think a certain way about risk, then that influences you. And you may be making a risk choice that's not really compatible with how you really feel. And it's really dampening that benefit of having diverse risk attitudes. And the other part about risk averse is that the definition technically is that you take fewer risks, all other things being equal. And as I mentioned before, all other things are rarely equal. Women are punished more severely for men if they make a mistake in a job that's seen as, not gender typical. Me walking down a dark alley at 3 a.m. in the morning is a very different risk from what it would be for you. And the other part is that experience plays into this. There's some research showing that actually when it comes to social risks, to speaking up, women are actually more comfortable taking those risks than men. And I think some of that goes to women's experience. I mean, I've experienced it many times being the only woman in the room, or one of just a couple women in the room who've experienced, you say something and you're either told you're too assertive or too bossy, or people ignore you, and the guy two chairs down 10 minutes later says the same idea, and everyone says, oh, brilliant idea. There's a word for that, heap eating. So I tend to, whenever people ask me about risk aversion, I'm like, And some of the research on women and finance shows that women tend to prefer getting more information, and that women and men of similar background and experience actually do make very similar decisions. You do see bigger gaps among less experienced men and women. Less experienced men are more likely to just leap without doing the looking. And I mean, yes, you could say that perhaps the risk A word might apply in that situation, but often, risk averse tends to be pejorative. And I'm like, that's actually a good thing. There's also studies showing that men who are overconfident and overtrade end up with lower returns. And so that ties this sort of risk reward connection there. That often people say, oh, no risk, no reward, but that applies a, linear in just one direction relationship, that, you take the risk, you're going to get the reward, when that's not really what happens. So I really tend to look at risk awareness, risk savvy, and really avoid using that word risk aversion, because it's so problematic in the way it's used.
Let me just heap that. That Aidan guy is brilliant. Did you hear what he said? But it's a real problem. I see it all the time, and I wanted to emphasize one of the things you said in the book, because you mentioned the author of a book called Own It, Sally Crawshank, And she paid the price for speaking up and being a threat to groupthink. And we actually need those people within an organization. And I thought it was amazing what she wrote. So she said she was fired for being different, for challenging the majority opinion, for speaking up, for daring to go against the grain. And she said that calling out risk, prioritizing the long term, and putting client relationships ahead of short term bottom line ultimately got her fired. You want those type of people, to your point, in your organization.
I'm such a fan of hers, for the decisions that she made, for speaking out, for sharing her wisdom, and and for the work that she's been doing with Elevest and Elevate. Really trying to change the way people talk about and with women when it comes to investing.
Well, I wanted to touch back on something you were going into the arena of this, where you mentioned, for example, the danger or celebrating somebody who comes in to fix the pieces of a broken organization, or maybe saves it, but could have actually been much more proactive and saved it from hitting the iceberg much earlier. And there's a term that is fantastic that people need to understand, because we have a lot of female CEOs who listen to the show. And you said the trend of companies choosing women for CEO positions when the organization is in crisis is increasing. In other cases, boards and investors tend to take a risk on women only in situations where men fear to tread. Despite the stereotype of women being risk averse, the trend of companies turning to women to lead through crisis is in challenging, potentially career suicidal CEO positions has become so common that it has its own term. It's called the glass cliff.
Yeah. And it's an experience that I can relate to very, very personally. And, have seen a lot of women in this position very, very publicly, placed in these positions. Many of them have succeeded. Some of them have failed in situations I think it would have been impossible to win. And again, here's an example of some of the research that suggested that women in, gender atypical positions are punished more severely than men. And, it's hard. I get asked a lot about women or people of color, in situations where speaking up is hard and potentially very personally risky, and where not speaking up, where not doing the hard thing, is very risky. But then on the other hand, I look at people who've been firsts in their field, who've done very difficult things, and to me, I mean, they're role models. They did it, and for me, that's even more powerful than if they didn't succeed. I mean, because I actually think it's an important message to get across that sometimes you're going to fail, and that's part of the learning process. And so it's very, very difficult making those sort of career choices. And in my Chicago launch, actually, that question came up. And Peter Kretikos, who's quoted in the book with the Institute for Work and the Economy, weighed in. I had a bunch of the people who were interviewed in the book who were part of that launch, which was so cool. But Peter said, that's where allies come in. And Peter has been one of those people who is a fantastic, white male ally. And it was actually a male friend of mine who told me about the heap eating term. Yeah. And so I think part of the challenge in those situations is to make sure that that other women step up to support the woman. And women are susceptible to some of those stereotypes as much as anyone else. And, I remember when Sheryl Sandberg came out with Lean In, and a lot of women really jumped on her for saying that, including some people with whom I'd had private conversations about exactly the same issue, that, they felt like they hadn't stepped up when they wanted to. And so I think that we all need to be more conscious of when we pile on to somebody for not having succeeded, and when they are put into a difficult position, to think about how we can be supportive, whether it's someone we know and, can offer concrete support, or whether it's someone that we don't know and we can support by not sniping.
Yeah, it's a great point, Michelle. And, you think about the Cassandras or the gainsayers who speak up, and you got to, again, look at the environment in which they do that. And like history shows us, it doesn't always end well, rarely ends well for a whistleblower. Very difficult for them even to find new roles within other companies. And we celebrate them, but at the same time, we kind of go, whoa, that was risky, and look at how it played out for them. And we need, if you want to call them corporate whistleblowers, for the internal team to be able to kind of go, whoa, I call it here. There's a grey rhino, there's an elephant in the room, there's a black swan, whatever animal we want to call out, that we do that, and we have the psychological safety, as you say, to be able to do that. But I wanted to share another thing. I mentioned earlier on about the value of the risk compass, or understanding the risk fingerprint of somebody I'm trying to hire. Again, if I do know the type of culture I'm trying to build, and then I'm going to go, I need to hire somebody of this type of risk fingerprint profile versus this type of person, understanding then generations becomes really important, because I found this fascinating. So somebody who witnessed, for example, their parents in the 2008 financial crisis lose their job, or their uncle or somebody like that, grew up into that. So their risk profile is going to be very different. And this then affects stuff like, because we often think, oh, well, those millennials, they don't want to buy houses, and they don't want to buy cars, and they don't get married, all this kind of stuff. But you're going to go, well, you got to look at where they were born into, the environment in which they were born. And then on top of that, I mentioned about the marriage. Did they have divorce in their world? Because that impacts their own risk fingerprint. All this stuff has a massive impact.
Absolutely. And it's also this sort of interaction between the personality and experience. I found, and some of these people are interviewed in the book, is that some people will go through a harrowing experience, whether it's, having started a business and failed, or having some big, political event, knock you out of the water that you have no control over. Some people come out of that saying, well, if I got through that, I can do anything. And some people come out and just shrink. It's like, we always think about, immigrants or refugees as taking risks, but, the calculation of, okay, I stay in this country and almost definitely die, or I go across these dangerous waters in a raft and I might die. That's actually pretty good risk choice. But, in the book, it's interesting. I talked to adult children of Holocaust survivors, who talked about, the parents, really becoming very conservative, and they passed on a lot of that to their children. And a friend who's a CEO of a family conglomerate in Central America, who's in his 40s. And there's a huge generational gap where the older generation, who lost a lot of the company and of what they owned during the civil wars, were all about preservation of capital. And the younger generation, who was kind of taking over with the leadership, were afraid of becoming obsolete and just shriveling away into the future. And I asked him, I said, well, have you talked to people about why they feel that way about those risks? Why is it important to the older generation to preserve capital? And that was, well, they want to preserve capital for the younger generation. And I'm like, okay, well, why aren't you listening to the younger generation? And it was a real spark for a conversation. And with millennials, it's interesting. You see a lot of these headlines, just like with women, risk averse. But you go into the conversations and you see that people, it's not that they're risk averse, it's that they're weighing things very, very differently. They want a job where they're going to be supported, where there's an upward path, where they feel there's some value to what they are doing. And those are actually things that reduce risk and that, increase career potential. Or you look at, say, the finances, the cost of college has gone up ridiculously. And they come out with tens of thousands of dollars of student loans. And you look at this, crazy toppy stock market, and seeing that interest rates are likely to go up, seeing that, price earnings ratios are at, ridiculous historical levels. is it a better bet to pay down your debt, which is, and I don't know what student loan rates are right now. I think they were about 8% when I had mine in the early 90s. They're probably less than even so, a guaranteed return by paying down the debt. Or, are you going to have a rainy day fund, or are you going to put your money into Bitcoin or GameStop or God knows what? I mean, it's different circumstances around the choices than what they were. And I actually just got a very interesting question from a Chinese reporter. The book just came out in China, and they were making a point about Chinese youth actually having had a very different experience from Western youth. I mean, you see this huge reduction in poverty in the past decades, and so this also changes depending on somebody's country, their socioeconomic circumstances. All of that goes into the differences, and with the houses, it's funny. Like all of a sudden, all the headlines now are, "Oh, the housing market is not going to fall because all of a sudden all the millennials are buying houses." And I'm like, okay, well, 2 years ago it was millennials don't want to buy houses, and so some of these headlines you've got to take with a big grain of salt, because they are so fickle, and that they do make a lot of generalizations about risk and certain demographic groups. And something is really important to recognize is that you need to look at the range within gender, within demographic group, because while there might be a certain average, there's a lot of difference within that, and you need to have the individual conversation rather than generalizing and making assumptions.
And one of the things you said there, which was interesting, was, for example, marriage rates. So we say, there's talk that people are getting married later, all that type of thing. But you say also, well, you got to zoom out again and have a look at that, because they're getting married later because they're more tolerant. It's because of their fingerprint, their risk fingerprint, and they're actually going, well, if I'm going to do it, I want to do it right. And actually knowing yourself more, back to your point about the leadership training, knowing yourself more, asking yourself questions of what do I want in life, helps you know yourself better, so you're able to find a better match for you. And then you can actually start thinking about things. Where do we work together in the tolerance perspective of all these kind of things? And then that correlates with a lower divorce rate as a result.
It's also societal change. I mean, in my parents' generation, not getting married was the biggest social risk, and people are calculating it very differently today. There was an online conversation I was involved in a couple months ago, where one of the things I often do is that we put in the chat, what's the biggest risk you've ever taken? And one of the answers was, and I followed up with, what's the biggest risk you've ever not taken? And because often those go right together. And one of the participants said, never getting married. I would not risk getting married. And so the whole definition of risk has changed generationally, and certainly among kids. Divorce was seen as a much bigger risk. It was much less common in earlier generations. And so, kids who have seen more divorce, women who've got more job opportunities, who've got more choices, it's a completely different risk calculus from what it used to be.
Last one for you, because I think this is so important to say. We mentioned about, all the different things that impact our risk fingerprint. And one of those is, so many of us are, if you think about privilege is so invisible for us. Like I was only saying this to somebody this morning. I grew up in such a beautiful part of Ireland in a wooded land, and we had such a beautiful view, and I had no idea because I was born into it. So I didn't know any better or any worse. But privilege has a massive impact on our risk fingerprint, where we come from, the experiences we have, the poverty we may experience, all these things. But one of these, and I wanted to share this because it's such a beautiful, beautiful story of somebody who just battled through that, is the story of the lady you interviewed, Jermico.
She's amazing. So if you've seen Beyonce's Lemonade video, she's wearing that awesome hoodie with the zipper, the swap out hoodie. Jermico did that. I met her in Chicago some time ago, and she's just this amazing, amazing entrepreneur. She's won all sorts of awards and honors, and she's just fabulous to talk to. But, she was a little girl growing up in the South and, didn't understand the risks of saying certain things, a little black girl in the South. And her family ended up moving her to Chicago because they didn't feel like it was safe for her to be in the South. And she was just amazing. She went out and she created the network of people that she needed. And some of that was just people who saw her promise, early employers, they saw how much she had going for her and actually took it upon themselves to give her the advice that she needed to lift her up. And then she learned to do that herself. And she's now trying to help younger African-American people in Chicago to learn some of the same entrepreneurial skills. But it was just absolutely incredible to talk to her and to see how creative and innovative she was, not just in the clothes that she makes, but in how she navigated a system that was not set up to make it easy for her. And she was just such an inspiration. And it was really an interesting juxtaposition against some of the other entrepreneurs that I interviewed. And one of them is a college friend who grew up in a family in Texas, who very openly says, I was able to go out and become an entrepreneur because I knew I had my family to fall back on, that I had that privilege. And these two contrasting stories illustrate a point in the book, is that, if you feel you've got nothing to lose, or if you feel you've got a big cushion, those are the people who are most likely to do the things that from the outside we think of as the biggest risk. It's the people in the middle who've got something to lose, but not a huge cushion, who, may have a job that they stay in too long, who may not be making the kinds of risk decisions that are the best for them, and who need to really be a lot more self-aware about risk to optimize the risks that they take.
Well, it's been a brilliant conversation as always. I have a quote that I want to use as my parting quote, but I want to leave you the final word of today's show. But where can people find you? Because I know you're about to board a plane and go to Dubai and do a talk. It's a fascinating talk, actually, because, we've talked about this before, the cop-out of the black swan, and you're kind of going, that wasn't a black swan, really. You just ignored it. It was a grey rhino coming for you. And you have this fascinating combination of a talk you're doing in Dubai.
Yeah, so black swans, gray rhinos, and dragon kings. Should be fun. But people can find me through my website, thegrayrhino.com, with an A, although the E will get you there too, but the A gets there faster. I'm active on Twitter at Wucker, Wucker. I'm on LinkedIn. I write not as regularly as I intend to. But where good intentions lead. But hopefully I'll be increasing the frequency of my column there as well. And I love connecting with people and hearing from them.
And you work with governments, you work with companies, you do keynotes all over the world as well.
Well, yeah, lately it's been more virtually. This is actually going to be the first time I'm on an airplane since before times. I do workshops. I'm trying to do a lot more applied workshops where people have a specific gray rhino that they want to deal with, and I help take them through the 5-stage analytical framework, and then with You Are What You Risk, helping them to develop better, healthier risk cultures within the organization, to understand their own personal risk fingerprints and that of the organization, understand better the ecosystem that they're in, and keynotes. Often I love applied stuff, big macroeconomic trends. That's what I really, really love. But I really do love also helping people to apply these ideas. So very, very flexible in that regard.
Fantastic. And Michele, one last thing. What are you seeing? What do you believe the big rhinos coming for us at the moment are in the world in general?
Well, I come from a policy and finance and economic background, and so that lens shapes it. And I always encourage people to to see what their own gray rhinos are, because that's how the concept is most powerful. But so from my particular point of view, for quite some time, I've been looking at the intersection of three gray rhinos: the climate crisis, financial fragilities, which includes, asset bubbles, high debt, and inequality. And all three of these, reinforce and make each other more dangerous. And one of my favorite observations from the gray rhino is that the zoologically correct word for a group of rhinos is a crash.
Fantastic. I love it. I'm going to quote a little part from the book that I loved, that I thought was a nice final message. And then I'm going to give the mic over to you to close today's show. This was a quote I loved. It's important to be aware if you are being stereotyped by others, and especially if you find that you are letting risk stereotypes affect your own choices. If you are, find ways to override what people think you are supposed to think and do, and own your own behaviour. Though the group we belong to plays a role, not everyone is as susceptible as others to the group dynamics. The different experiences of groups go to show how risk ecosystems, the support systems, the events that define the era, the preconceptions that others have of us, all affect our risk fingerprint. Being aware of those influences can help each of us consider risk more wisely and to be understanding of why our friends, relatives and colleagues make risk decisions that they do. The good news is that most of us are more capable of improving than we might think. Understanding how our pasts have shaped how we perceive risks and respond to them helps us to identify and develop empathy towards others with different stories and lives, which is such a powerful skill. And that, my friends, is why this book is such a great read. It's been a pleasure sharing the work of Michele Wucker once again. Michele, over to you. What's your final message for our audience?
Thank you so much. It's always wonderful to talk with you. But I think you've really picked a perfect way to sum it up. Is it to really think about self-awareness, risk self-awareness. There's a statistic that we make 35,000 choices every day, give or take, I assume. Every one of those risks is a choice. Every one of those choices is a risk. And way too often we are taking risks without understanding why. And so once you really delve into your own risk fingerprint, it can open your eyes to how you see the world and how you interact with it. One of the most powerful experiences of this book was the people I interviewed at the end of the interview, just their eyes getting big and saying, I learned so much from the questions that you asked. And so I'm hoping that readers will have the same experience that a lot of the interviewees did.
Author of You Are What You Risk, The New Art and Science of Navigating an Uncertain World, Michele Wucker, thank you as always for joining us.
Thank you.
And as always, thanks to our sponsor Zai, a global financial services company specializing in foreign exchange and payments and supporting innovation in all its forms, including this show. You can check them out at hellozai.com.
That was so much fun.
Thank you. It was great. I always learn so much from you. It's such a great chat always. Thanks so much.